Well, welcome everyone. This is going to be a great talk tonight. Last month we heard about the Tacoma Tree Foundation's approach to enhancing Tacoma with trees, especially in areas where there's a low tree density. So tonight we're going to hear Sarah Hamman talk about the approach from the Olympia Coalition for Ecosystems Preservation. And one of the things I found on their website that I thought was a great phrase is, we are re-envisioning Olympia to function as a natural ecosystem, fostering healthy places and people. So we look forward to hearing about that. And Sarah is the Vice President of the Board of Directors for the Olympia Coalition for Ecosystems Preservation. She also wears many hats, which you probably, if any of you know her, you'll know those many hats. But she is also the chair of Research and Plant Inventory Committee for the Washington Native Plant Society. So we welcome you, Sarah, and you get to share your many hats in one hat, or just if you have other things that you want to share along the way about yourself, please do. And if you all would put any of the questions you have for Sarah in the chat, we'll cover questions at the end, and I'll monitor that at the end of her talk. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen here. Get started. Okay. All right. And Gail, I'm going to ask, can you see the presenter or the presentation or the notes mode?
We see your presentation. It looks lovely.
Okay. Great, thank you. Just to confirm. All right, thank you all so much for coming tonight and for your support and interest in the Native Plant Society. I'm going to talk tonight about one of the organizations that I am proud to be part of. This is the, as Gail mentioned, the Olympia Coalition for Ecosystems Preservation. We go by OLI Ecosystems for short, so I think I'm going to say that every time instead of the long name. But this organization really has only been around for a couple years. This group started just back in 2014, and I want to give you a little bit of the history of how this organization started, and then walk you through the work that we've been up to over the last 7 years or so, primarily focused on the West Bay of Olympia, West Bay of Budd Inlet. So to get started, for those of you that aren't familiar with the organization, OLI Ecosystems' mission is to protect, preserve, and restore the diverse ecosystems of Olympia that include the freshwater, shoreline, tidal waters, and upland forests that are home to the Pacific great blue heron, cutthroat trout, salmon, and their companion species. And as Gail mentioned, this group is really focused on not just restoring habitat for wildlife, but also creating green spaces in urban areas for people, and trying to do so in an equitable way that provides access to nature in places or in spaces where we might not otherwise have it. Olympia is a very green city, but there are often limitations to accessing some of the state and city parks that exist around the area. So we really have a vision of this idea of thriving nature and thriving human communities together in a sustainable urban ecosystem. So the organization started, like I said, back in 2014, really by a group of concerned neighbors. So on the west side of Olympia, for those of you, well, for anyone that is familiar or isn't familiar, just northeast of the co-op, if you're familiar with the West Side Co-op, if you know that area, there is a heron rookery or a nesting area that has existed for many years. And in about 2013, 2014, there was a proposal to cut down these alders and some of the firs and cedars that existed in this nesting area to make a townhouse development, or to build a townhouse development. And the neighbors, many of them directly adjacent to this parcel, were really concerned because they knew the herons were nesting there. They enjoyed the view and the wildlife there in the woods. And so they petitioned against that development, but also started raising money and started organizing. And they were able, with several generous donations, to actually purchase that parcel. And they quickly formed their own nonprofit, Oli Ecosystems, and got to work right away restoring that unit. And so just to give you a little bit, I'm going to talk through the restoration process here, but just to give you perspective here. So this is the area I'm talking about here. You can see outlined in the red and yellow and red on the western shore of Butt Inlet here in Olympia. And then if you zoomed in, this is that same unit. You can see, I think this is about 2 acres here to start, where that heron rookery exists. And you can see there's a lot of trees around and forested areas around that parcel. And I'm going to talk about how the organization has really expanded its scope along West Bay Drive here. So initial work involved restoring that heron rookery, right? So on the left, you can see the heavy ivy infestation. The ivy had climbed all the way up to the tops of the trees. There actually had been a holly plantation at that site. So as you can imagine, that has led to a challenging legacy for removing the holly. But just over a few years, the organization and a suite of community volunteers were able to clear the ivy, clear the majority of the height of the holly, cut the trees down, and just repeatedly cut. And I think they might have used some basically herbicide injections into the stems to really focus the impact just on the holly trees. But they were able to remove the ivy and the holly from that area, and some blackberry as well. And you can see, instead of this dark, kind of uninviting, invaded forest, now it's this open alder forest, but with a diverse understory, all of which was planted by volunteers. And several deciduous and conifer trees were planted in there to help start to rebuild that mid canopy and eventually upper canopy as those alder trees start to fall. And this has involved a huge community effort. These are pictures taken from throughout the woods, but really, when I joined the group in 2017, we were hosting about 2 work parties a month, and primarily in the fall and winter months. I want to make a quick note here that the herons actually start building their nests right about now, right around Valentine's Day in mid-February. And if the nests are successful, they will actually stay in those nests and rear their fledglings and through July and sometimes even into August. So we actually close the heron rookery area during the spring and summer months from February to August to allow the herons to go through their life cycle there, their nesting period there. And however, over the last few years, this group, Oli Ecosystems, and the community has worked together to conserve a lot more than just that initial rookery. So we have a lot more work to do and opportunities for both habitat and recreation. So over the last 6 years or so, we've really expanded our scope beyond that initial parcel to include everything you see here in yellow or gold. This outline equals about 22 acres, and then farther to the north, there's another 3-acre parcel that I don't have, that's not shown here. So a total of about 25 acres. Most of the properties are pretty heavily degraded. These have all been logged in the past, at least once, maybe twice. Many were home to kind of home sites or camps for the mill workers. There used to be 11 mills along the shorelines of Olympia in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And they all lived many of them lived right along West Bay and East Bay. So we've actually uncovered quite a few kind of really old, but old campsites that we've had archaeologists come out and check on as we've removed the ivy in these areas. A lot of this work has been done with volunteers, but we've also worked pretty heavily with work crews. The conservation, before I jump into that, the conservation of these sites has cost upwards of $3 million in terms of acquiring the sites, of which about 2.5 have been through private contributions. We have gotten some grants, about $500,000 from Thurston County and elsewhere, but most are from private foundations and community donors. Also, several of these parcels have been donated themselves by the landowners. These all were privately held, and we have either opportunistically jumped on them when they went up for sale, or kind of proactively communicated with the landowners to see if they were interested in donating, many of whom have been interested due to their desire to protect these areas and also protect their view shed out to the sound. So I'll mention that a little bit more in a bit. So out of that 25 acres so far, we've restored about 8 of those acres, little bit by bit. We've built 3 rain gardens, and I'm going to talk about the rain gardens and the restoration and throughout the rest of the talk here. But that's usually, as I mentioned before, that's been through the engagement of hundreds of volunteers and the work of some WCC crews. We've invested, we try to recruit and support local work crews and businesses. We estimate we've spent about $350,000 in local businesses, and that ranges from the engineers and the planners to the WCC crews to the rock teams that come out and place rocks for us for our rain gardens, to the arborists, to the native plants, the native plant producers that we purchase our plants from. And we expect that with the work ahead, it'll likely take about $100,000 a year for the next few years to complete the majority of the restoration on these sites. And as I skipped this, but we've easily planted over 15,000 native plants so far in the last few years. That's probably a pretty major underestimate. Okay, so whoops. So this has really created this beautiful kind of pocket park, right, in West Olympia, where we have a lot of native species. There's still a lot of ivy, if you can see walking through where we've worked and where we haven't. But a really nice trail going through the site, and I'll point out kind of the overall direction of the trail in a bit. But so great habitat for a lot of understory species to get established, and then recreation areas for folks to utilize, that connecting the Northwest neighborhoods down to the shoreline. So in addition to the native plant restoration and the invasive removal, we realized there was this kind of highly needed, but also important opportunity to think about stormwater and stormwater treatment. All of the stormwater that's coming off of Northwest Olympia is going through the Northwest Olympia neighborhoods from Braun Avenue North all the way up to Schneider Creek, is going into the West Bay Woods. And so in order to make sure that stormwater is clean, we have some work to do. So far, we have installed 3 rain gardens, or 3 stormwater treatment installation or infrastructure units. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about those. But for those of you that aren't familiar with kind of the problem that we have here in the Puget Sound. I like this image. This was made by the Nature Conservancy to show the value of forested land cover in terms of treating stormwater. So as rainfall hits the ground and washes over impervious surfaces or surfaces that don't allow infiltration, it picks up all the pollutants that we have generated through our gardening, our landscaping, our vehicle traffic and maintenance. And that polluted water often runs directly into our water bodies, the creeks, the lakes, and eventually Puget Sound. Sometimes it's directly into Puget Sound. A lot of the stormwater before some of the work in the West Bay Woods was done actually went into stormwater pipes and went underground, and many still do go underground straight into Butt Inlet. And here you can see with this little infographic on the left side, it's showing in 1 acre of area that's covered by impervious surfaces, roads and parking lots, there's about 1 million gallons per year of polluted runoff that enters the Puget Sound, and only 3,000 gallons of water that enters the groundwater. Whereas in a situation where you have 1 acre of forested land, only about 208,000 gallons of water gets into the Puget Sound, and that's typically filtered and cleaned as it moves its way through the forest floor. And 311 gallons is then going into, 311,000 gallons is then going into the replenishing the groundwater. And the difference there's about 500,000 gallons difference between the forested and the impervious surfaces. That's all going into the vegetation and into the soil and into the animals that are living and utilizing that space. So some of the common pollutants that are often found in stormwater include some of the basic things we use to, support our gardens, nitrogen and phosphorus. Those can, if overused, can collect in the stormwater and run off the lawns and the gardens into the stormwater and directly into the sound, which can lead to algal blooms and deplete the water in Butt Inlet and the Puget Sound of oxygen, making it lower quality habitat for aquatic organisms. Heavy metals certainly are very common in stormwater, largely from our mechanical and engine usage. All of our traffic, all of our traveling contributes to the heavy metal concentrations that can be detrimental to aquatic species. Fecal coliform bacteria from sewage, from septic systems, and from animals on the landscape, all wash into the sound. And then this last compound, some of you might have already heard of. This was actually just discovered in 2020. The 6-PPD is a tire preservative that is used basically to limit the impact of ozone on the breakdown of our tires. It's used worldwide. And it was just discovered actually by University of Washington and Washington State University researchers who were trying to figure out what is killing our coho salmon. And through some tireless experimentation and deduction in terms of getting down to the actual chemical, they discovered that the 6-PPD itself doesn't kill the coho, but when it is exposed to the air, it converts, when it's exposed to ozone, actually, it converts to the 6-PPD quinone. And that compound is immediately toxic to coho. And that compound is entering the Puget Sound all day, every day. And so that is, and sometimes, directly from the roads, directly into the sound. And that is likely what has contributed to the dramatic drop-off in coho populations over the last 15 to 20 years. So, we want to think about ways that we can address and help to reduce these stormwater pollutants, and in many cases, potentially even completely remove them from the water that's entering the Puget Sound. So, we have developed a couple different types of stormwater treatment facilities, which now are called green infrastructure installations. This first one is at the east end of Dickinson Avenue. This is basically a common rain garden. The area at the end of the road here that was pooling up with water and then eroding the slope below it was dug out, and about a 2,000 square foot rain garden was put in place. You can see what this looks like here. It's all the activity is below ground, so it's hard to really see what's happening, but basically different layers of sand and gravel and compost, and sometimes there's inoculated layer with different fungi and bacteria to help filter and clean the water. That's basically layered in there, and then native plants are placed on top and around to help pull up and some of those nutrients and water as well. There are certain plant species that can be used that are able to bioaccumulate and process heavy metals, for instance. Willows are a great example of that. And so that's something that we've considered in our planting regimes, is thinking about plant species that can accommodate some of these pollutants. So we worked in that central habitat area for both the wildlife species that were there, building understory plant communities, and really supporting the great blue herons through the removal of the ivy. We then realized, there was opportunity to expand our restoration efforts and expand our green infrastructure to clean more of the stormwater. So at the end of Hayes Avenue here, you can see Hayes Avenue, there's a couple that's layered here with the labeling. Hayes Avenue runs off, and there's a lot of water that comes down Hayes Avenue during a storm and just dumps into the West Bay Woods. So here's an image of what used to happen during a heavy rainstorm. So that water would just come flowing right off Hayes Avenue into the forest, and it was eroding and making this really basically dangerous and eroded slope. The culvert pipe was way too small to accommodate the amount of water that was coming through, and it was easily blocked. So we worked with the city to replace the plumbing, basically all the piping at the end of Hayes Avenue to accommodate larger water flows, which we're already seeing, but certainly we expect more of in the future. And here's just another image of the flooding that would take place just during a typical rainstorm of an inch or so that would really fill up this area just below Hayes Avenue and erode away the slopes. You can I also want to point out the reed canary grass, the ivy. I don't know if you can see any of the blackberry, maybe some blackberry off to the right. There's got to be some holly in there. Not a terribly healthy understory plant community at this spot either. So we removed a bunch of the ivy, all the ivy that we could get our hands on, and the blackberry. We put in, this was a very steep area, so we placed erosion control, burlap, logs, cardboard, mulch, and then native plants after the ivy was removed. And then we graded, basically created a new swale with the new piping to create, to help to control the direction of the water. And we put some erosion control rocks in there, some stream cobbles and boulders to help create this, what we call a bioswale. And this was heavily planted with native species that can, one, utilize and take up some of those stormwater pollutants, but also species that really like the wet soil, so they would persist and grow. And I should mention also, there are homes on either side of this trailhead at the end of Hayes. And so we also wanted to plant things that would help to provide some privacy for those neighbors. So there's some evergreen huckleberries, and rhododendrons right along the edge that will be growing up to provide that privacy. Whereas most of the species that are planted within the swale are deciduous. And so in the wintertime, it's still pretty open, but then it fills up completely in the summertime. So after this was all put together, we fenced it off just to protect it from the deer for a couple years. But it's been working beautifully now for 3 years at slowing the water down, at keeping it from eroding the slopes. And, we have this beautiful rain garden now, or basically stormwater bioswale that's helping to slow the water down and clean it as it moves down the slope. Okay, I want to talk about 2 more areas that we're working on. This last piece now, or this next piece is up on this northeastern section here, right along West Bay Drive. This was an area that we acquired by working with a developer who actually wanted to turn it into a set of condos. And he had the whole plan ready, but we worked closely with him for many months to negotiate and develop a plan that would work to turn it into conservation land. And so over the last 2 years, we've been doing just that. On the top left, this is what we started with, kind of what most of the forest looked like initially, just a wall of ivy from top to bottom. And the ivy was covering all the blackberry on the bottom, but with some really intrepid WCC crew members that worked just so hard. They're incredible. And lots of volunteer hours and days. Much of this was happening during COVID over the last 2 years. So our volunteer days were much smaller for 2020 and 2021. We'd only have a few people at a time. But we were able to, cut the ivy from the trees. So it's opened that forested area up and remove the ivy and blackberry from the surface. And then just over MLK Day this year, we had a fantastic volunteer day where we had about 80 people come out and we planted about 2,500 plants into this area where all those non-natives had been removed, and we had already put mulch in place. So I'm going to see if I can play this video. It might be a little choppy, but just shows what the area looks like now. This is during the volunteer day. All the pots ready to plant. Okay. You can see the forest is much more open. And you can actually see down to the water. And I'm going to just hold this right here for a moment. So this is a ravine that actually collects water from both Dickinson and Hayes Avenue. We've put the rain gardens, the bioswale up at the top to help clean the water and collect the water, but a lot of water still is coming down. And if any of you have walked this road anytime in the last few years, certainly throughout the wintertime, all winter, the sidewalk is flooded and the road gets flooded. Even this last week when it hadn't rained for 2 weeks, the sidewalk was still flooded. That water has nowhere to go just because it all spills out onto the old parking area that was used for the steel mill that was across the street. And so it's all compacted and it does not drain very well. So we are going to be working with some engineers in the city to actually put a stormwater pond into that old parking area. And I think I have a picture here. Yeah, so this is from the road looking in. We're going to build a stormwater pond that's going to be planted within and around by native species, filling up almost this entire parking area. And with some benches. And this is also going to be one of the 3 trailheads along West Bay Drive that will go up into the West Bay Woods. And there'll be a lookout here, viewpoint that looks out across the bay. So that's the plan for that central area. Big plans, we're still working on we've been on we're a year into the permitting process with the city. So stay tuned. We hope to be able to start that work this year, the actual digging. Okay, the last area I want to talk about is this area in the southeast. If anyone has walked along or driven along West Bay Drive recently, you've seen a lot of change happen down in the southeast portion of the West Bay Woods. This is directly across from the northern edge of the West Bay Park, the city park there, that the city put in, I'm gonna say 7 years ago. It's probably longer than that. It's longer than that, probably 10 years ago now. But really, we've coordinated with the city to kind of help them develop their vision of having a trail that runs all the way from downtown up to Tugboat Annie's, to really connect that whole West Bay. Now, I think their vision initially was to have that along the waterfront, and that still could happen. But basically, what we will have likely before any waterfront trail is the trail from the park moving up across the street into the West Bay Woods here, where we already have a trailhead that goes up to a lookout. And then the trail will eventually connect all the way through these deep ravines, probably a few bridges, all the way over to the Heron Rookery, and then connecting to the trail that's already existing all the way up to the northern trailhead up here at the north end of the woods. So all in all, it'll be about a mile of single track trail that will be created throughout the whole West Bay Woods. So when we acquired this parcel, this is what it looked like. Same problem as many of the other parcels. A lot of ivy reaching up to the tops of those alder trees, and about 6 to 8 feet of blackberry that you just kind of had to balance on as you walked across. Not a very friendly place to explore. And you'll see some interesting growth patterns here. The trees had been continuous and shrubs had been continually cropped to maintain the view shed of this site, because there's a private home just uphill. And we've worked very closely. In fact, we actually purchased this parcel from those landowners, and we've worked very closely with them to negotiate and work out a plan that will maintain their view shed for the next 40 years. So we are not planting any trees that will grow up into their view and block their view of Mount Rainier and of the water anytime soon. So we are focusing on lower stature trees and shrubs in the area where they can see out, and planting the taller trees around the sides. And that's, in this case, there's plenty of things that can get established on this open slope. And so we've been able to focus on that. And in exchange, basically, they're going to have a trail in their front yard coming up past their house that the public will be able to access. We are also working with them, and we've planted several species that will provide an additional privacy fence, basically green fencing, to shield their house from the activity below. I want to point out this view because I have another picture later from the same viewpoint, but this was about, I think, 2.5 years ago, looking north from that point. You can see the water to the east. And it's a steep slope at that time covered by blackberry and ivy. So we used what's called a spider. I had never experienced this machinery before, but it's basically the same kind of machinery or equipment that's used on ski slopes. It can climb really steep slopes, and it basically had a mulching unit at the end of it that could, like an arm with a mulching unit, like a big claw, that could reach out and just mulch, like tear up and mulch the blackberry and any stumps, or it was just incredible piece of machinery that we were able to use to pull out the ivy across this whole site. Then we went back in, grubbed out a lot of the roots, And over about a year's time, we were able to clear out the ivy that was there and mulch the site and start planting. When we did that, we realized, and this is just one of the views here, once all that ivy and blackberry was removed and the site was mulched, you can see, you can see the landscape and kind of how it's arranged here a little bit better. We also quickly realized that there was a lot of water that came down through this site that presumably before the blackberry and the ivy all soaked up and held within all the litter. And so we quickly had to come up with a plan to manage that water so it would not be eroding the slope. So we placed another kind of bioswale here. And you can see the rocks coming down. And we have, I think, maybe 200 willows planted to help also pull up that water, any of the pollutants that might be coming through. This is draining a little bit off of Braun Avenue, if you know where that is, a really steep road that goes up towards the co-op, and some of the neighborhoods and properties right up there on Braun. So we again planted thousands of trees and shrubs and understory forested species. And this again, this picture right here in the bottom right is the same view looking to the north with the water on the right that I had taken where you saw all of the blackberry and ivy. So we cleared out those trees in the distance and are really kind of starting over here. And just 3 weeks ago, we basically sculpted this stormwater treatment kind of green infrastructure facility to help catch that water that was coming down just in time for the major storm that we had in early mid-January. So that helped to really infiltrate the water so it wasn't just flying off the slope onto the sidewalk. And all of these plants were put in by, I think many of them were grown by Marshall Middle School students and all planted by those same students that worked in the nursery program at Marshall Middle School. So it was pretty cool for the students to be able to, see their work full circle from planting the plants from growing the plants in their nursery there at Marshall to then coming out and helping to restore the site with their own plants. Okay, to wrap this up, I want to talk a little bit about kind of the vision that Oly Ecosystems has for the West Bay shoreline. This is one that is partially driven by the development of the West Bay environmental assessment. And I should say it shares kind of the vision of the West Bay environmental assessment to a point. So the West Bay environmental assessment, which I believe this map was pulled from, was developed by the City of Olympia, the Squaxin Island Tribe, and the Port of Portland. And those three entities got together and developed a plan, basically, and a vision for the potential restoration and management of both the upland shoreline and the actual near shore and marine environment in each of these reaches that are identified. The West Bay Woods, basically, this whole area I've been talking about is encompassed between Reach 3 and Reach 5. So that whole area fits just within that section. Reach 2, this is the Garfield Nature Trail, for those of you that are familiar with that area. And then up at Reach 6, this is Schneider Creek, which is one of the major drainages in West Olympia. And historically had actually a salmon run. But unfortunately, the culvert that connects Schneider Creek to the Puget Sound has not been the right size or actually placed in the right way. So it's not actually connected. There's multiple culverts that aren't connected for many years. And so I know that's something the tribe has worked with the city on, and that's a story for another day. But we really share this vision with some of those partners to restore the shoreline itself, to avoid development on the Hardell and the Reliable Steel parcel, which is this one here that has, if anyone's been downtown in the last 30 years, you can look north towards the Olympics, you see that big warehouse that's falling apart on the West Bay shoreline. That's the old Reliable Steel warehouse. And unfortunately, the Reliable Steel property is very heavily contaminated. And Department of Ecology has just released some more information showing that the Hardell site has not been completely cleaned sufficient for development yet either. So there are some challenges to the development of those parcels. Happy to talk more about that if there's questions. But really laid out in this plan was this beautiful vision for what the shoreline could look like if restoration were to take place to restore some of the natural nearshore and marine habitat that would then be potentially connected to the upland shoreline forest. So that is something that at Ole Ecosystems we have been kind of advocating for, and sometimes just with education and opportunities to talk like this about what the shoreline could look like. In other cases with lawsuits with the city. So we're trying our best to keep that option open. I will say we're not completely opposed to all development on the shoreline. There may be a good place for smart and sustainable development, but we need to think about what works for that land and what works for the community in order to move forward sustainably. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to chat for a while. And I really want to just thank a lot of different organizations and people. As I mentioned, so much of this work is done by volunteers. All of us, I didn't mention this at first, but all of us at Ole Ecosystems, it's a totally volunteer board. We don't have any staff yet. That's one of our goals, is to be able to hire an executive director or program manager in the next year. So keep your eyes open for a job ad if we can get that together. So I thank you again for your attention, and happy to take questions.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much. I appreciate this great opportunity. I'm amazed at the how much community effort and how much collaboration with many different organizations and governments and things like that you've had to deal with. And so I'm going to ask my first question. And you described some of the problems that happened with that, with like maybe the city or something like that. But overall, like, what was a really good experience, and maybe what was an experience that you really learned a lot from in this collaboration with all these different entities?
That's a good question. So we've had a lot of success and just openness to partnership with the city parks department and the stormwater treatment department. I mean, I mentioned permitting is taking a while. That's not unusual. And I don't, there's no one at fault for that. It just takes a long time to get through all of the steps. So, that's been a challenge to get through that, but we recognize the need to kind of make sure that it's all the work is going forward in a sustainable and productive way. And yeah, I think I've just been so encouraged by the number of people and the dedication of the community to come out. I mean, people, not just the neighbors that are coming out to work on these sites, but people will bus over from Lacey or Tumwater or Tacoma to work at this site. So I've been really thrilled to see the community support and people showing up to pull ivy, which I know is backbreaking and hard work. But but yeah, I mean, even every work party, I'm just amazed how much progress is made. So yeah, and working with the different partners, we've gotten some small grants from the Squaxin Island tribe, and I've hosted members of the tribe to come out and talk to us about different plant species and the traditional uses and the value, and so to help guide our species selection. And since this is all Squaxin land, really, and then obviously worked very closely with the city on the planning. One thing I didn't mention is that the city actually owns a couple of the parcels within the West Bay Woods. They have the right of ways from the ends of all the roads down to kind of crisscrossing through the woods. But we have a memorandum of understanding, basically a signed agreement with the city that we will co-manage those parcels and share resources to do that, and that they will be protected in perpetuity, that the city will not develop those. So that's been a really positive experience with the city, with the Squaxin Island tribe, and then just with all the community partners.
Well, thank you. So there's a question about the trails, where the trailheads are. Can you, especially there was some that are in work and some that are existing. So
Yeah.
maybe go through that, at least the existing ones. Where can they start? And is that on the website?
Good question. It should be on the website if it's not.
Okay.
I don't think it is. So yes, I will talk to our secretary, who's also the web developer of the board. We all wear lots of hats on the board, but yes, let's see, the trailhead that is open and accessible, there's three. One is on West Bay Drive, and it's not marked very well on the sidewalk, but it's kind of at the northernmost portion of the woods on West Bay Drive. And so let's see, it's not too far across. There's not an address really that I can give that's easy to show. There is a City of Olympia trailhead marker just up the slope a little bit. You can see it from the sidewalk if you look in. And it's just kind of at the northern end of where that big warehouse is. So just past the warehouse is on the right. Just past that on the left is the entrance to West Bay Woods from West Bay Drive. You can also enter from the end of Hayes Avenue, the eastern end of Hayes Avenue, which is up in the Northwest neighborhood, and the eastern end of Dickinson Avenue, which is just a little bit north of the West Side Co-op. The last thing I'll say, the Dickinson Avenue trailhead is right by the Heron Rookery. So that is, you'll see a sign that says that that's closed until July or August. So come August, you can get in that way and do a big loop. But from February until August, you can just go from the Hayes Avenue down to that northern end.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So getting comments on how great the work is, so that's good. We don't really have any other questions, and I
think I saw a hand go up. Can Nova? A couple hands.
Oh, I'm not getting hands. Oh, okay. So right now, just for those who are raising their hands, do type your question into the chat, because right now your mics aren't on. So, here we go. Here's some more comments. How do you engage with the community to get volunteer help?
Oh, great question. So we advertise on Facebook. And so I guess that requires that you already are associated or able to see that on your Facebook, or that you use Facebook. We give talks like this often to several different local groups, to neighborhood associations, to schools. And we we have a newsletter. So if folks are interested in learning more, we post information about our work parties and events on the newsletter. And let's see, we used to post things in the newspapers. I don't think we've done that for a while. And locally, we will post signs sometimes in the woods when there are upcoming work parties, so that folks walking through, because there's often so many people walking through, so they know when something's coming up and like, oh, okay, in 2 weeks, there's going to be a work party here, or usually it's just for the week in advance. So those are mostly local efforts, but yeah, those are our primary outreach tools. If you have some additional ideas, I'd love to hear them.
How often do you partner with WCC, and what are the typical costs?
Yeah, so we partner with WCC very frequently. We usually have about 6 or 7 weeks of WCC crew time each year, more if we can afford it. Let's see if I can remember. The costs are around, well, it depends on how many people are in the crew. Typically a WCC crew has about 6 people. The last few years, there's rarely been a full crew because of COVID challenges. And so you only pay for the number of people that are there, and they work 10-hour days, Monday to Thursday. And I'm remembering it's somewhere between $2,000 or $3,000 a week for a crew. And so I need to double check that. I might be wrong. But less than $5,000 a week for the crew. And so usually when we have some areas that are going to be too difficult to access for a volunteer day, or if it's particularly if it's blackberry removal, the WCC crew has all the tools. They can use they can use power tools, and they have those skills and the training to do some more complex activities. They actually had to rope up and belay down on one of the slopes to remove the ivy a couple weeks ago. So that was exciting for everyone involved. And so, yeah, they've been a great resource for us. And, it's been really great getting to know them. We try to bring them cookies or some kind of treats every day they're out there to keep them excited when it's, raining and 38 degrees. So so far it's been a really great partnership.
Thank you. With so much traditional economic emphasis on growth and profits, how do you account for the new and growing public concern about sustainability and habitat protection?
Let's see. So I'll answer what I think that means. And then Nova, if you want to expand, please do, or drill into a different part of the question. So I think one of the considerations here is something I mentioned early on in the presentation, that as Olympia continues to grow, both out and up, we may be losing access to some of the green spaces that may have been kind of informal green spaces or just backyard green spaces. And so having these publicly accessible, really local parks that people can access, you don't have to drive to Mount Rainier, or you don't even, if you live on the west side, have to take a bus over to Watershed, Park, which is another fantastic local park. We have Priest Point Park, Watershed. We have these really beautiful city parks that are fairly accessible. But I think, making sure that we have green spaces for people to utilize, regardless of where you live in the city, is going to be important. And so making sure that we promote sustainability with our building and with our green spaces is really important, I think, to be a responsible community. And then, habitat protection, I think, this is important certainly for all the species I've mentioned so far, but one thing I haven't mentioned yet is when the WCC crew was out working 2 years ago, a mountain lion just strolled right past them in the West Bay woods. And so, just highlights the importance of these habitat corridors that exist for animals to move through. Almost certainly that mountain lion was able to travel up to Schneider Creek and move up Schneider Creek, which is not protected, but it's so steep, it's not buildable. And so there's these important opportunities for habitat corridors to protect and provide resources for wildlife species, even within the urban core. So I know that may raise different concerns of safety for people having mountain lions here, but I don't know that that's ever something we'll be able to totally control. And if we can provide resources for them, in these green spaces instead of in backyards, that I think that's probably a good thing. I don't know if that answered your question, Nova, if you have any other follow-ups.
We at least learned some new and interesting ideas about the place. That was great. Thank you, Sarah. All right. Well, I'm not seeing more questions. If you guys want to, maybe I'll give a minute here if you want to type fast. But I do appreciate that. Oh, here we go. I knew somebody would be typing fast. I always think when I'm typing really fast to get it in before they close. Do you develop a plan for the WCC crew, or do they develop it?
Yeah, we usually develop the plans for the WCC crews. So they, show up at the beginning of the week on Monday, and we'll kind of do a walkthrough with them. We luckily have had the same WCC crew lead for 2 years now. And she's very familiar with the site and knows kind of the short and the long-term plan, so that's been helpful. But yeah, we develop the plans and work with them sometimes on a daily basis, but at least on a weekly basis to kind of make sure they're on board and they know what to do and kind of what the next steps are. And we're all on a texting basis. So if they run into any issues, they can text me or Daniel Einstein, the president of the board, or there's one other board member that they can communicate with to get help if, or get answers if they have specific questions. But they are, I will just say, for the WCC crews, they come with most of their own tools and their own vehicle, and they're very self-sufficient. I've just been really impressed by their work.
So Neva wrote, thanks, and she wonders how humans will learn to live, learn, and let live so that a surviving natural ecosystem has a chance to thrive in the future with climate warming and growth and all that stuff. I'm sure there's many things applying to that. So that is something that we are always challenged with, I think.
Yeah. Well, and I'll just add one more to that, Nova, in response to that comment that probably could also be in response to your previous question. In regards to the shoreline, where I said, we have this vision of a restored, at least a partially restored shoreline. Again, we're not completely opposed to smart and sustainable development, but all of that shoreline along West Bay Drive, everything east of the road is fill. That's all dredged material that was placed there to support mills and reliable steel. And so the natural shoreline is kind of where West Bay Road is, and even farther back in some cases. And so that is not incredibly stable land to begin with for building. Parts of that property, the reliable steel property, currently flood at king tides. And so, that would require a substantial amount of more fill in order to keep it from flooding in the future. And because it's heavily contaminated, the proposal, at least for the Hardell site, is to cap it and put fill on top of it. And, as I'm sure many of you might recognize that's not a solution. That's just extending the problem out for the next generation to resolve, right? And it continues to allow for any leaching of those contaminants into the water column of the sound. And then, thinking about climate change and sea level rise, we've already seen with West Bay Park, developing green space or like a natural shoreline that can accommodate that sea level rise instead of building there on the shoreline and then building a seawall. Is, that shoreline provides a lot more resiliency and just space to provide for that shift in the sea level and habitat as well for organisms. I don't know if you saw it. It was a little detail on one of those last slides showing oyster beds. If we could restore the natural shoreline, or at least some semblance of that natural shoreline, there's a potential to have some of those Olympia oyster beds set up. So there's some oyster farms there right down in Butt Inlet. So they will help to clean up some of that remaining stormwater that would be coming in. So there's this opportunity to have, Nova, like you're saying, to live, learn, and let live, so that we can survive and thrive. Not just us, but the ecosystem around us can thrive going into the future.
So downright, so this is a very interesting and encouraging, and he thanks you. And he wants to know if there are other planned conservation projects in other locations, or?
Yeah, it depends which hat I'm wearing. But for the Oli Ecosystems hat, yes, we actually have acquired a parcel over in Green Cove Creek, which is northwest Olympia. That actually is one of the remaining salmon runs, and that eventually runs over by Evergreen State College. And so off of 14th Avenue and Kaiser area, there's Green Cove Creek that has just a healthy salmon run, and it has Olympic mud minnow populations. There is a growing knotweed problem there, but most of the site is inaccessible. I mean, it's walking through waist deep muck and and water, so it's not a very accessible site for volunteer work or for any work. So we're going to have to be thinking creatively about how to address some of the knotweed challenges, but for the most part, it's in pretty good shape. So that's in partnership with Capital Land Trust. And some other private landowners. We're trying to conserve as much of the Green Cove Creek watershed as possible for the remaining salmon or the remaining endangered species that exist there.
Well, it looks like you got a volunteer, so I bet that makes you feel.
Yeah.
Go, Naomi.
Thank you, Naomi. Yeah. Oh yeah, that's right. I should mention we usually, I shouldn't say always, but we try to post all of our volunteer events and work parties coming up on our website. And before COVID, we had an annual gala, and sometimes it was outside, and we had bands playing. It was at the West Bay Woods when we were first getting started. The last time we had it was actually at the Capitol Theater in the Black Box Theater, and it was just fantastic. And we had local bands and speakers and really good food. And so we hope to get back to that again, because that's just been a really awesome community gathering opportunity that I'm sure now so many of us are just really excited to get back to someday. So yeah, I'll keep your eyes out for that. Hopefully maybe in 2023 or 24, we'll be able to do that again. But yeah, in addition to the work parties, we do sometimes have some speaker and just gathering events.
I kind of oftentimes wonder if it's those opportunities that do help us change some of the ways we've been thinking in the past and being more sustainable and thinking of others around us, including the environment. So that probably is ways that we kind of make that transition and change as people.
Mhm.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you again, Sarah. This has been really an important opportunity to learn about our community and opportunities to work in it. And I'm amazed at how many groups that you are working with to make this happen. And it
So many good ones out there.
Yes, exactly.
So
And
many
it's
great
like
opportunities.
it takes all of those because you need the city to get
Yep.
to to buy into what you're doing, and you need to have the community buy in. So
Right.
all of that has just been I know is going to make that a very successful project and to sustain it for a long period of time.
Yeah. And I mean, I live on the west side. It's not my direct backyard, but I walk and run through the woods almost daily. So it's, I have to admit there's a little bit of a selfish component where, I'm part of the community that this is benefiting, right? I mean, ideally it's the whole community, but it's really awesome to have, an intact forest that's accessible by foot to walk to. So, yeah.
Great.
So thank you all. Really appreciate the opportunity.
All right. Well, I think we will transition now. Gail Scalar is going to talk to us about Native Plant Appreciation Month.